On today's show, we are going to take a look at what NHL oddsmakers have to say about the Dallas Stars and the rest of the NHL for this 22-23 season. We'll look at the odds for teams to win their conference, to win the Central Division, and some individual player awards. We'll talk about it all on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily in-season podcast covering the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Monday, August 22nd. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring Locked On Stars listener, thank you for stopping by today's show and for making us your first listen every single day. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button on YouTube as we are trying to make it to 1,000 subs by the end of the year, 2022. So help us in that journey and hit that subscribe button down below. You can also find and follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. Remember that we are free and available no matter where or how you choose to listen. Thank you guys again for tuning in, and wanted to talk today about some odds, some betting odds for this upcoming NHL season. The official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network, BetOnline.net, has recently put out a plethora of odds. You guys can check that out for yourselves, but wanted to take a deep dive into some of these odds today, talking about the conference odds, mainly for the Western Conference, but we'll talk a little bit Eastern Conference at the start. Talk about the division races, specifically the division races in the West as well, with the Central and the Pacific, and then some individual award races, the Hart, Norris, Vezna, and Rocket Richard Trophy for most goals in a season. But do, of course, want to start out by looking at some of the conference odds for this season, because even if, whether or not you are someone who bets on sports, this is still very good to take a look at, very interesting to look at, because you can tell a lot about the public opinion, whether it's the media or just the general public fans, people who support teams, who watch the NHL. You can tell a lot about the public idea of a team or organization based on where they stand in rankings like these, or based on how these NHL odd makers think they should be positioned, and that includes every single team. You even look at the Eastern Conference in the conference odds on BetOnline.net. The top teams to potentially win the East or finish near the top of the standings are a lot of the teams that you would expect based on what we saw last season, as well as this offseason through trades, free agency, what have you, with the Florida Panthers at plus 475, the Carolina Hurricanes at plus 555, Toronto also at plus 555, Tampa Bay plus 575, and the New York Rangers coming in fifth at plus 900. Again, pretty much what you would expect. I think the Florida Panthers will be back and still be very good, even with the departure of Huberdeau and Weegar. They do have the arrival of Tkachuk, who will be a fantastic player for them, and will certainly add a ton of spice to an already spicy Atlantic division, going up against teams like Toronto and Tampa Bay. I do really like Carolina, even though, there's a reason that they're second on this odds list. I really do like Carolina to potentially be a favorite to win the East, although I can see Toronto also staking a claim for that as well. I think this top three makes a ton of sense, and even Tampa Bay and New York, I expect them to be competitive and hanging around that conversation for the majority of the season. But things do also look very intriguing out west as well, where I do want to spend the majority of this segment. Surprise, surprise, the Colorado Avalanche are the clear favorite to win the West as of right now at plus 185. And then there is quite the cutoff. And again, you would really expect a team like Colorado, who just had as dominant of a cup run as they did, to potentially come back and repeat and win the conference. They pretty much mopped the floor with the conference in regular season, in the postseason, and they're returning the majority of their players, minus, Nazem Kadri and a few other, key pieces, to even guys that are some role players. But they're still going to be an incredibly difficult team to play night in and night out. And that makes for a pretty significant cutoff in the odds department, but there are still plenty of good teams and some teams that are potentially worth betting on, such as the Edmonton Oilers at plus 600, The Calgary Flames plus 800 with, despite the departures of Tkachuk and Gaudreau, still going to be a great team. Keep an eye out for them, especially with the aforementioned Nazem Kadri now donning the Calgary Sea of Red and gold. If that's the color, I could be getting that color wrong. Maybe it's more of an orange. But then you have the Vegas Golden Knights at plus 900, the Minnesota Wild plus 1,000, the LA Kings plus 1,200, St. Louis plus 1,400, and then you get to our Dallas Stars all the way down at plus 1,800. And this is just such an interesting list, and of course we'll talk about a little bit below this list here in a second, but just some of the things that caught my eye. The Vegas Golden Knights, I think that they're going to be a decent team. I think they'll be fine. They certainly do have some good talent, especially in the forwards department. But with that goaltending situation, at least at the time of recording this on Sunday evening, Robert Lehner is not going to play at all this season. Those are the reports that we've seen, and they really don't have a legit starting goalie as of right now. I imagine that they're going to make some sort of move. They better not even think about trying to go out and get Jake Ottinger. If they want a Stars goalie, they should pursue Anton Hudobin. It would be a win-win for both teams. They get a goalie in Hudobin, and it takes a little bit of cap space off of the Stars' books. Not a ton, but maybe would help, entice Robertson and Ottinger to sign their deals a little bit sooner before training camp, because maybe you as the Stars front office could offer them a little bit more money. But Vegas, I think they're going to be a good team. They were fine last season. They were plagued with injuries. If they're healthy, I think they'll be a little bit better, but I really don't see them being the fourth best team, I think, according to these odds in the Western Conference. I don't see them being better than the Los Angeles Kings. I just personally don't see it. I think Jack Eichel, once he has a full season, I think maybe he'll be a little bit better, but will it be enough alongside some other really good talent with Marcia Salt, Mark Stone? Like I said, they have pieces. I just don't see them being that good, and I probably wouldn't take that bet at plus 900 for the Vegas Golden Knights to potentially be the fourth, fifth best team in the Western Conference, and I definitely wouldn't bet on them to win the Western Conference this season. There's way too much talent ahead of them with the other teams in their division, as well as Colorado. Minnesota is another intriguing team. I'm not surprised to see them where they're placed based on the regular season that they had last year, but they just have a lot of questions and some, I don't know, things that you just kind of have to hold your breath for until the season starts. Starting in net for them, Marc-Andre Fleury, and no, this is no shade or disrespect to Marc-Andre Fleury, one of, if not the best goaltenders in the history of the league, certainly in recent memory, certainly in my generation, but he's 37, and he's going to turn 38 in November, and we've seen goalies, still be pretty effective in their late age, and, I'm not saying that Marc-Andre Fleury is going to completely drop off, but you just have to start wondering, when is Father Time finally going to catch up to him? Because it catches up to every athlete, but especially goalies. We've seen guys way younger than Marc-Andre Fleury suffer from injuries, and it affects their games, either where they cannot play or when they do play, they're not the player that they once were. And it, it's going to be truly sad once, we're in a world that doesn't have Marc-Andre Fleury, or at least not a top high quality Marc-Andre Fleury, but that's the number one guy in Minnesota right now. And if he doesn't, pan out, you have Philip Gustafsson, who's still pretty unproven so far in this league. And I don't know if you trust him to be the guy for your squad for the majority of the season if Marc-Andre Fleury were to get injured or for some reason unable to play a huge chunk of the season. They're also running back a pretty similar team to last year, minus one of their best players in Kevin Fiala. And while it was great in the regular season, once they got to the postseason, they just kind of hit a wall. So now the question is, are they just going to be repeats where they have a really solid regular season? Or will kind of the slump from the postseason carry into the regular season as well? Definitely going to be keeping an eye on the Minnesota Wild through the early stages of the season. And the last team I want to talk about out west, a team in the Pacific Division, the LA Kings, who I think are going to shock a lot of people this season. I say shock. I feel like there's plenty of people already kind of jumping on this bandwagon of the Kings are going to be a great team this season. The Fiala pickup, as I mentioned, I think is great for their team, adding to the core of Drew Doughty, Anze Kopitar, Jonathan Quick. This team has some great pieces set in place, and they just took the Edmonton Oilers, who made it to the Western Conference Finals. They took them to 7 games in round one. Now they've gone out, and I think they've gotten a little bit better this offseason. And I think they're going to be a very interesting team to watch in this Western Conference race, especially out west in the Pacific Division. I certainly believe that they will finish top 3, and I think could even potentially have a shot to sneak up and take that top spot. Of course, that's a long ways away, and only time will tell on that prediction, but really do like the Kings as of right now, and I think they're going to be an incredibly fun team to watch. And then BetOnline, actually shockingly, and we'll dive into this a little bit later when we talk about divisions here in a second, BetOnline actually has the Winnipeg Jets at plus 2,200, projected to win the West over the Nashville Predators. Predators at plus 2,500. So not a huge separation there, not a huge difference. I just think that's interesting that whoever was making these odds at BetOnline thinks that the Winnipeg Jets have a better shot at winning the West than the Nashville Predators. I don't think that that is even a remotely good take, but there's probably a reason that I'm not out here making the bets and the odds for this NHL season. But once we come back from a quick break, we are going to talk about the division races and the odds that BetOnline has set up for this season. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by the NHTSA. You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes too many, and as the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. You think of calling for a ride, but you live nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, your job, you total your car, you kill somebody? Everyone knows the risks of drinking and driving. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. Moving on this Monday episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for making Locked On Stars your first listen every single day. We are shifting our focus from conference odds to division odds, and want to start out, of course, talking about the Central Division where the Dallas Stars will be playing, and it looks very similar to how things ended last regular season. The Colorado Avalanche, by no surprise, are projected to win the Central Division at minus 175. Again, this team is bringing back most of their really good core that was such key players in winning the Stanley Cup against the Tampa Bay Lightning back in the summer. So it's no shock that people believe that they have a great chance to repeat. And you can put me in that boat. I think Colorado will likely win the division yet again this season with maybe a little less or more competition rather this season, but I still think that they will have a pretty steady hand. Even if they get off to a little bit of a slow start like they did last season, I think kind of once they hit that midpoint of the first half of the season, maybe late November, early December, maybe even into mid-December, I think that they're really going to be hitting their stride if they stay healthy, and they're going to be a difficult team to beat this season. And then BetOnline, the way they have the rest of the division shaping out: Minnesota at plus 400, St. Louis at plus 900, Dallas at plus 1,100, Nashville at plus 1,200, Winnipeg plus 2,000, and then get ready for this one: the Chicago Blackhawks at plus 20,000 and the Arizona Coyotes at plus 25,000. So I would not be placing any bets on the Blackhawks or the Coyotes to win the Central Division. However, if you do make that bet and you end up being correct, you could make quite a bit of money, but it's probably not worth it because those teams won't even be in the playoff race by the end of the first month of the season. But the rest of this, if you look at this and you look at the playoff bracket and you look at the standings at the end of last season, this is literally how things ended in the Western Conference, or at least in the Central Division for last season, and what shaped the playoff picture, with Colorado winning, Minnesota, St. Louis, Dallas barely edging out the Nashville Predators for that fourth spot in the division to get the first wildcard spot, and then the Predators, of course, getting that second wildcard spot by placing fifth in the Central Division. And you guys, if you've been listening to the show for a while, especially this summer, you already know that I think the Dallas Stars could compete for a top three spot, kind of depending on how Minnesota and St. Louis perform and how good Dallas is with the departure of John Klingberg, but also with the additions of players like Colin Miller and Mason Marchment. And then, of course, with the new system under Coach Peter DeBoer. And as we've talked about before, and as I'm sure many of you longtime hockey fans know, that Pete DeBoer teams always overachieve in year one, either, making it to the Stanley Cup Finals or the conference finals if you're coaching the Vegas Golden Knights. So obviously we can't just expect that that's going to happen, but I think that there is a reason that happened, that 3 of the 4 teams he's gone to have had excellent seasons in his first season there. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited because there certainly are good pieces in place for the Stars to be successful. And so I do think they have a legit chance to compete for a top 3 spot in the division. But even if they're not there, I think they can realistically land in another wildcard spot. And as we saw this past season, it doesn't really matter where you land in the postseason bracket. You just need to get into the dance, and then you have a shot to be successful and potentially take down a team, as the Stars were an overtime goal away from taking down one of the top dogs in the West in the Calgary Flames. So I do think that the Dallas Stars at around 4th to win the division right now, those are pretty good odds, and I feel like pretty realistic, although depending on how Minnesota and St. Louis do, and as I've talked about at length, I think the Wild could maybe not take a full-on plunge, but maybe could dip a little bit this season or maybe go on a little bit of a cold streak, and I can see St. Louis potentially doing that as well. But I know St. Louis, this is kind of their last year with their main core intact. I think that this time next year, the St. Louis Blues will look drastically different. So I think that they're going to try to run it back one last time. And they always are just a tough out with the Dallas Stars. Those two teams always play incredibly competitive and cold-blooded when they go up against one another. So I expect all of those games to be really intense this season. And the Predators are also an incredibly interesting team. I think they're going to be extremely competitive and could potentially flirt with a top 3 spot as well. They made some really nice additions. Not even an addition, but just keeping Philip Forsberg was huge for them. But then they go out and they get, Niederreiter, and they go out and get McDonough from Tampa Bay. Just add these really nice veteran pieces to their squad. They're going to have a healthy UC Saros. They're going to have Roman Josi. And they were a tough out for the Stars last season as well, and a truly competitive team that, just got a little bit injury plagued near the back end of their season and into the playoffs. Still don't think they would have beat Colorado in round 1, but I think they maybe could have squeaked out a game rather in that first round series, but they get swept. But I think that they're going to be back and healthy this season, and I think they're going to be an incredibly intriguing team to watch. The Pacific Division on the other side of the West will also be an incredibly fun watch throughout the season. Their odds right now are Edmonton at plus 240, Calgary plus 250, Kings 375, Golden Knights 385, Vancouver at plus 1,000, the Seattle Kraken at plus 3,300, Anaheim plus 5,000, and the San Jose Sharks coming in at plus 5,000 as well. I think that Anaheim and San Jose being the same is wrong. I think Anaheim is maybe a little bit better than this list is giving them credit for. I think they will probably finish above the Seattle Kraken. I wouldn't be shocked if we see that happen, but maybe Seattle will take a little bit of a turn this season and maybe have a little bit more success in year 2. But the biggest takeaway from all of this is, one, the Battle of Alberta is absolutely going to slap this year. I don't know how many games those teams are slated to play. I imagine 3 or 4 with them being in the same division. And I would hope 4, if the NHL is smart, that's how they should make the schedule and give us 4 games of that series, because it's always fun to watch. But now with the new additions, especially to the Calgary Flames, I think that this is going to be an incredibly fun matchup, and it was supposed to be really fun in the playoffs, and I feel like we maybe got robbed a little bit of seeing a truly intense Battle of Alberta. I really wanted to see 7 games out of that series, but the Oilers, after taking a few tumbles early in the series, just came out full force and kind of ran away with things later in that series. But maybe that's a credit to the Dallas Stars for wearing out the Calgary Flames before that series started, but I digress. Edmonton to win the division, that's probably a really safe bet. They have the best player in the world, and the second best player on their team is maybe a top 3 to top 5 player in the world. So they're always going to be a great bet and a great team to, say, hey, I think they could go out and win their division year in and year out. Calgary, I think it makes a lot of sense to have them near the top 3. And like I've said earlier, the Kings are a heavy sleeper team. And the Vegas Golden Knights feel weird at 4th, but this is also just the division and not full on the Western Conference. So maybe it makes a little bit more sense. Like I've said, I think the VGK will be just fine. And we really also just don't know what to expect from the Vancouver Canucks this season. Will we kind of see, are we going to see a team that, is just kind of middle of the pack, or will we see the team that was fighting and scrapping and clawing for a playoff spot last season before it was just too little too late? Will JT Miller be able to put up the same numbers he put up last season? Tons and tons of questions for the Canucks this season, and I don't really know what to expect from them, but they're going to be a team that I'm going to want to keep my eye on to see where they stand amidst all this, because they really did have their moments last season where they looked like a legit playoff team, and there's some people that think they're ready to take that next step this season, and then there's probably a camp of people that think that they're going to just be a middle-of-the-pack team that could give some, really good top-tier teams some trouble on the occasional night. But keep an eye out for the Vancouver Canucks. They've got some nice pieces and a good coach as well. But just looking at all of this and kind of based on my thoughts, I think that we could really realistically see a lot of the same teams, if not all of the same teams, from the 2022 playoffs in the 2023 playoffs, with maybe just some different seeding. Of course, that's probably not going to happen exactly, just because there are changes to the league throughout the season, at the trade deadline, injuries, things like that, things of that nature. Teams are never going to be the same at the start of the season as they are by the end. But just kind of based on what I'm seeing, it wouldn't really surprise me if we saw maybe 80 to 85, 90% of the same teams make the playoffs again this season. And, as a lot of the teams that were competitive last year, I think are going to be competitive again this year. But then there's going to be the teams that are bad or out of the playoff race by trade deadline time. And I think by the trade deadline, there will be a good idea of who's going to be in and who's going to be out. And the teams that are out of the playoff race, I think that we will really see them start to tank extremely hard in order to get that first overall pick and draft Connor Bedard to their organization, because he, at least as of right now, is a guy that could potentially change the course of your franchise. So really wouldn't surprise me if you see a team that's kind of sitting middle of the pack or below middle of the pack at the trade deadline to just kind of give up, sell out at the deadline to get as much draft capital as possible and do all they can to potentially get that first overall pick in the 2023 draft. Well, coming up next, we will take a look at some odds for individual player awards, the Hart, Norris, Vezna, and Rocket Richard Trophy. All of that coming up after another quick break. All right, we are closing out this Monday episode of Locked On Stars, talking about some of the odds for individual player awards according to BetOnline.net. They have odds as of right now for the Hart Trophy, the Norris Trophy, the Vesna Trophy, and the Rocket Richard Trophy. And some early favorites for the Hart are, of course, Connor McDavid, Austin Matthews, and Leon Draisaitl. McDavid at plus 260, Matthews at plus 500, and Draisaitl at plus 750. And those are names that you would expect to see on that list. And then you have to scroll down a little bit to find your first Dallas Star and only Dallas Star on the list. I didn't get a count of exactly how many people were on the list. I would guess maybe around 30 to 50, somewhere in that range. And the only Dallas Star I could find on that list, pretty far down, maybe in the middle of the pack, was Jason Robertson at plus 6,600. And I think that that's about right, especially given that Robertson is extremely young, but a guy who has a ton of offensive upside and will likely be one of the best offensive players in the league throughout the entirety of his career. And at the end of the day, this is just an incredibly tough award to win if you're not a just purebred superstar like Matthews, McDavid, or even a guy like Draisaitl. What Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin used to be. It's just a tough award to win if you're not a guy who is consistently putting up 100-plus point seasons, 40 to 50 goal seasons. I mean, you really have to be bringing the heat with your numbers year in and year out to be even in consideration for this award. And your team also usually has to be incredible and having a fantastic season. So really, I think the only way that Robo can even be in consideration for this award, he would have to absolutely dominate individually. I'm talking 50-plus goals. I'm talking maybe 110 to 115, 120 points. And the Stars would, it sounds ridiculous, it sounds insane, but they would literally need to win the President's Trophy while Robertson is having one of the best individual seasons of all time to even be in consideration for this award, at least this season. I think there will come a time where Robertson will have built a lot of credibility and maybe, be a top 5 player in points or maybe a top 5 player in goals. And you might see his name in the conversation, but just with this being his third season, I think it would really take a lot for him to be in consideration for this award, but still really excited to see what we can get from Jason Robertson in year 3. And then you shift focus to the Norris Trophy, where some of the odds are a little bit more favorable for the Dallas Stars, but a little bit of a surprise, some of the odds that I saw. You, of course, have the usual suspects of Cale Makar plus 150, Roman Josi plus 750, and Victor Hedman at plus 800. Then you've got Fox, Ekblad, McAvoy, and then you have Moritz Seider above Miro Heiskanen. Moritz Seider, the Calder Trophy winner for the Detroit Red Wings, outstanding defenseman, really good player at plus 2,000, above Miro Heiskanen, who's at 2,500. So, of course, not a ton of separation there, but I just think that's shocking. And I think that, it's just another chip on the shoulder for Miro Heiskanen. I'm sure that, about him personally, the little I do know about Miro Heiskanen, that he probably cares less about the preseason odds for the Norris Trophy. But it's just, kind of again, just adding to this narrative that isn't necessarily a narrative that a lot of people are buying into, but one that you could make an argument for, that maybe Miro Heiskanen is starting to be forgotten amongst some of the elite defensemen in the league, especially after, his season last year where he missed a majority of the second half of the season with mononucleosis and maybe didn't put up the numbers you would expect. But I think this is going to be a huge year for Miro Heiskanen where he can shock some people. And I think that he's better than a lot of the guys on this list above him. I think he's better than Seider. And I think that goes without saying because Seider is still an extremely young player. Miro is too, but he has several seasons of NHL action under his belt. I think he's better than McAvoy. I think he's better than Ekblad. Fox, Hedman, Yossi, Makar, I think you could make arguments are better than Miro Heiskanen, but I think he's still in the same ballpark and conversation as those four players. I think he's certainly, when he's at his best, a top 5 defenseman in the league. So if things, fall in his favor, I think we could legitimately see Miro Heiskanen be a finalist for this award this season. Then you have the Vesna Trophy, again headlined by the names you would expect to see: Igor Shesterkin at plus 300, Andrei Vasilevsky at plus 500, Elias Sorokin of the New York Islanders at plus 700, UC Saros plus 1,000, Markstrom, Demko, Hellebuck, Anderson, and then you have Jake Ottinger at plus 2,000. So this just goes to show the amount of good goalies in the league, but some of these guys, and not that making the playoffs has all to do with whether or not you win the Vezina Trophy, but I think you can tell a lot about a player by the record of their team and the strength of their record and whether or not they make the postseason, how deep they go in the postseason. Guys like Shesterkin, Vasilevsky, and even a guy like Saros, who had a fantastic season before his injury. It just goes to show that there's guys that come and go and fluctuate as far as being a goalie in the NHL, and they're maybe only good for a handful of seasons. And then you've got your Vasilevskys and your Shesterkins who have been good for, quite a few years now. And Ottinger, similar to Jason Robertson, I think is also just suffering from being extremely young and maybe still unproven a bit. I mean, he did have that fantastic playoff series against the Flames, but for people who haven't been watching the Dallas Stars consistently for the past couple of seasons, maybe they still just haven't seen enough from Jake Ottinger to put him higher on a list like this. But similar to Miro Heiskanen, I think if Jake Ottinger gets the majority of starts this season, if he stays healthy, I think that he could have a fantastic campaign and find himself in Vezina Trophy conversations. And if not this season, it's not the end of the world. I think his time will come where he can find his name in this conversation and maybe even potentially win a Vezina Trophy at some point in his career. Because goalie seasons, something else you have to keep in mind is the seasons that goalies have fluctuate like crazy. Some guys are great one year, they're okay the next year, or really bad, and we won't really know until the season starts. And then even when the season does start, some guys may start slow and pick it up, or vice versa. We could see a guy have a hot start in the first month of the season and then absolutely fall off a cliff for the remainder of the season. And then we close things out with the Rocket Richard Trophy, the leader in goals, headlined by Austin Matthews at 250, Leon Draisaitl at plus 550, McDavid plus 700, Alexander Ovechkin at plus 1,200 as he continues to chase history. And then you have Jason Robertson a little ways down at plus 2,500. And Jason Robertson did miss quite a few games last season due to injury. Not quite a few games, only a small handful. But I would hope and expect him to be a lot healthier this coming season where he plays the majority of games. And if he is able to stay healthy, I can see no reason why he can't maybe potentially flirt with being in the top 10 in goals, having scored 41 in an already quote-unquote shortened season for him last year. I think that he could be set up for success in this Pete DeBoer system, likely still playing on that top line with Pavelski and Rope Hintz. But we'll dive into more award projections as we get closer to the season, and maybe some of the odds will shift and fluctuate. These are always fun discussions to have. But thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Locked On Stars. That is going to wrap things up here. Thank you again for making us your first listen every single day. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or the follow button if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform. You can also leave us a 5-star rating and review on Spotify and Apple. It helps the show out a ton and helps new people find the show. Thank you guys again for tuning in. We will be back here on Wednesday with another episode. We'll see you there, Stars fans. Have a great start to your week.